Hello, I'm Carl Herzog, public historian for the USS Constitution Museum, and we are coming to you live from the Morrison Library here at the USS Constitution Museum in Boston for another episode of our virtual series, Sailing Through History. This will be the last of these for this season, but stay tuned. We'll have more exciting programming to come, I'm sure. Today, we are going to be talking about how USS Constitution maneuvered in battle using her sails and how that worked and how the ship actually was able to steer with all those sails. This is a conversation, so please, we welcome your participation in the chat and pose your questions, and we'll answer them as we go along, and hopefully I'll learn a little bit more. Again, feel free to answer those in the chat. When we see images of Constitution, or for that matter, pretty much any other square rig sailing ship, often in the form of models, what we see are the sails arrayed in sort of a square fashion, and often set up, particularly on models, as being perpendicular to the ship itself. So this is a really misleading thing, and it gives us the impression that the ship was not particularly maneuverable at all. In fact, if this was true, then the only way that the ship was going to move is if the wind, indicated here by the arrow, was blowing right behind it, pushing on those sails and pushing the ship downwind. But in fact, that's not how the ship worked. It is, in fact, limited in where it can go relative to the direction of the wind, but it's a lot more maneuverable than many people think, and it used that maneuverability to bring guns to bear. Keep in mind, all of Constitution's guns are located on the sides, and so in order to fire at the enemy, they had to position the ship so that those guns were facing the direction they wanted to fire. So to do this, they were turning the vessel, but angling or bracing the yards around, the yards being those spars that are holding up these square sails. They had to do this because if, in fact, all you could do was face the sails forward, then once you tried to turn up into the wind, all that would happen would be that the vessel would blow backwards. So instead, they angled themselves relative to the wind. And by doing this, even still, it may seem as this isn't particularly effective and that it may not catch a lot of wind. But fortunately, because they could brace or shift those yards around, pivot the sails on the mast, then the wind could actually blow directly into them. Now, this seems like it would cause the vessel to slide sideways, but the hull in the water kind of acts like a wing too, and eventually moves in the path of least resistance, which is forward along the bow. So it can sail this way. And it can do this in either direction, right, with the wind coming over either side of the ship. And so it was able to use this to maneuver and sail upwind. But to go upwind, then to get to your destination, meant either tacking or wearing, changing the side of the vessel that the wind was coming from in a zigzag pattern as you tried to work your way forward, going one of these two directions. The other way that they could maneuver the vessel and make it turn was to balance what's called the center of effort and center of resistance. And this is kind of like an old-fashioned wind vane, like this one with the rooster on top. This thing always points into the wind, the direction the wind's coming from, right? Or points to the direction, in this case, that the wind's coming from. And it does that because it has this big rooster tail and feathers at the back of the arrow, and those are constantly swinging the arrowhead around toward the direction of the wind. So that's a great tool, and it can be emulated on board the ship by setting and reducing sails on different sides of the ship. If you imagine this arrow as being the ship itself from bow to stern, the arrowhead being the bow and the tails being the stern, then they were able to do sort of the same thing with the wind. If you needed to turn into the wind, you wanted to change the balance of where the wind was blowing. And so to turn the vessel up into the wind, you could either take down altogether some of the sails up on the bow end area, leaving more of those sails back aft, which will turn it up into the wind, or you could trim them. You could just spill the wind out of them while you were trimming in and tightening those aft sails, mizzen sails against the wind. And in particular, this small sail at the back, known as the spanker, that we can see the gaff-shaped sail here at the back, serves as sort of a driver, turning the ship either toward the wind or away from the wind. By balancing these forces, you can not only change the direction the wind's going, the vessel's going relative to the wind, you could also park it all together. This is a picture of HMS Guerriere and a blow up from a painting of a series of paintings of the battle between Constitution and Guerriere. And in this broader one in the foreground, not shown in this excerpt, is Constitution bearing down on Guerriere, who has decided to stop and wait for Constitution to arrive. They are downwind, upwind rather. And so they did this by heaving to. If you notice, the foremost, the right-hand mast, the sails are catching wind normally as they are on the mizzen, the aftermost mast. But that middle mast, the mainmast, we can see that the sail is blowing backwards. It's blowing contrary to the other two sails. This configuration causes the sails to work against each other. And in the process, the ship ends up not going forward, not really going backward, but just sort of scalloping along and basically putting it in park while they waited for the other ship. Now, if you had to turn the ship through the eye of the wind, tacking the ship, it meant having enough momentum by moving those forces so you could turn the ship up into the wind and then shuffling those sails around to adjust for that. So the momentum would carry it up as far as it possibly could. And at an earlier point, you may brace around the aftmost mast where you can see my hand in this picture, and that continues to push the stern around, driving the bow up into the wind. At some point, At some point, the ship will turn all the way up into the wind, ideally, and not get stuck there, that the momentum will carry it through. And once it does, then you're first bracing around that mizzen mast, but keeping these foremast sails set the way they are so that then the wind will backwind them and begin to push the bow around away from the wind. This is a super tricky procedure and it can take quite a while, and you stand the prospect of getting stuck in the process. This is what happened in Constitution's battle with HMS Java. Java had lost their headsails and as a result had no choice but to head up into the wind and were forced into tacking, but they stalled out and were stuck in irons, essentially, that's called, pointing directly into the wind, unable for a few minutes to move. But that was the critical few moments that allowed Constitution to then wear around, turn their stern through the wind, a much easier process, as we'll see in a second, and then launch another blistering broadsides attack on Java that made all the distance in that battle. If you succeed in tacking, once you're finally over onto the other tack, you can head off on your merry way. Now, the amount that you can sail upwind is based on how far over you can brace these yards, and those are restricted by the angles of the shrouds that are holding up the masts. But if you wanted to wear where you are turning the stern through the eye of the wind, That's a lot easier process because you can keep the wind in the sails the entire time. The downside to this process is that if you're trying to work your way to windward, work your way upwind, you're going to lose ground doing this because you're continuing to sail downwind as it happens. But because you're keeping the sails full, you're also keeping momentum, keeping movement, and it's a lot easier to do. You just follow it all the way around, and there are some shortcuts you can make to do this, but essentially you're just moving the yards for the most part as the wind changes its direction relative to the ship. Wearing was much more common than tacking in battles, and as a result, you see a lot more of that. This is a diagram that was done by a crew member of the battle with HMS Java. I like to call it the dance diagram because it reminds me of those old dance footstep maps of where to go. But this, while it's not exactly to scale relative, to the symbols, it shows what choreography this is and what a dance this really is between the two ships trying to take advantage of each other. Each time that you can see that they are turning around, they're trying to get the better of each other to rake them so that you're positioned rather than facing each other side by side, but that you're facing either the stern or either the bow or super ideally the stern of your enemy ship. That way you're delivering the full broadsides of your guns and they have very little left to respond with. This is even more devastating from astern because the steering wheel, the rudders, the stern galleries are a lot of glass windows. The ability of cannonballs to blow through that, bounce down the deck, ravaging the ship much more dramatically is astonishing from that. So it's this constant jockeying for position. And as you can see in the third set of these over to on the left-hand side of your screen, there was the red Java raking Constitution in the beginning scenes of this battle. And this actually did blow away Constitution's helm, forcing them to go to emergency steering. And so for quite a bit of the ways, they were forced into straight steering while they went along, but eventually regained themselves. So this wearing was a constant maneuvering dance, each of them trying to get the better of their opponents as they did. The advantages of all this sail are that you can move very swiftly through the water. This is the classic Gordon Grant painting of Constitution showing, mostly full sails and stunsails headed out from the side and all the rest of these things set. This was not the case in battle. In battle, you were reducing the amount of sail that you were carrying because while you wanted to be able to maneuver, you also wanted that same crew to be able to work with the sails to work the guns. So your sailing crew is also your gunnery crew. They were on what were known as quarters and stations. The whole crew is obviously divided up into watches, a starboard and larboard, starboard and port watch. And those are when the ship was sailing, you had one half of the group resting or doing other work, and one half minding the ship. Everybody's all hands going into a battle, but they're broken up into quarters, which is their battle assignment. Often they were assigned to these groups of guns and an opposing gun on the opposite side of the ship. And all of their detailed responsibilities down to what role they were playing narrowed out there. But they also had stations that were determined by what sail evolutions were occurring. If they were tacking, if they were wearing, if they were setting sail, if they were shortening sail. Here in the full painting that we had looked at a brief bit earlier, we see Constitution's crew, all of them aloft on the sails, reefing the topsails. This means reducing the amount of sail area that's exposed to the wind on the topsails. And you can't see it very clearly in here. Let's see if I have a blow up. Not quite. you can't see it particularly clearly here, but the little tiny blue and white dots up on those yards are the individual crew. There would be as many as 40 of them up there on the main to reef this sail down. With the shortened amount of sail and by striking those lower course sails, you achieved a couple things. You didn't have to assign your crew to do other work on the sails while you were going into battle, and this enabled them to actually work the guns instead. Um, Reducing the courses, those lowest sails, also reduces a lot of that canvas hanging right over your head that was prone to catching fire if it caught fire from the gunnery. So all of this sets up to minimize your sailing crew requirements as you're moving forward and going into battle. But occasionally, depending on what happened, you were then assigning crew back to reset more sails. This is another picture up from that same battle where Constitution and the forwardmost area has reset not only this is still showing the reefed topsails, but you can see that they've set a top gallant, that third sail up on the mainmast. So quite constantly in battle, you were changing your sail configuration if you wanted that extra speed because you had to get into position ahead of the other guy and maneuver or chase someone down. This was a constant balancing act too. When we talk about seamanship, this is what we're talking about, is that rote muscle memory of a crew being able to execute these commands under fire to get the ship where it needed to be to most effectively make use of their guns. In another painting, we can see where this one's a little bit pitched. They are under sail, but are boarding over to the bow of a ship with nearly everything collapsed. And from the watch quarter station bill, here's a great example of how much labor and choreography that this entailed. This is from Peter Turner's watch quarter station bill, which is actually in the collection here at the USS Constitution Museum. And this is a depiction of the yards on the mainmast with the names of each topman, each crewman serving up in the rigging and where they were assigned to at the time. Constitution could continue to sail like this throughout this time period. And even without that 450-man fighting crew, later on, sailing a ship with these full topsails and courses and top gallants and the rest to get around continued until the 1880s. This is the last known image of the ship under sail before 1997 when it set sail again. And at this point, the ship was actually operating as a training vessel for young crew members on board, teens who were going to finish out high school and then serve as a pathway to becoming enlisted sailors in the Navy. And with a very similar configuration to what the ship would have carried going into battle, this is the ship under sail on its 200th anniversary in 1997 when Constitution sailed from Boston up to Marblehead after an extensive renovation determined that the hull was strong enough to withstand the strain of the rigging and was able to set sail under its own power again for the first time since that 1881 sail into the Chesapeake. This is an incredible amount of work. And to even be able to do it in 1997 was an astonishing feat that included incorporating not only the entire Navy crew of Constitution, who trained on a number of other square rig sailing vessels in preparation for this, but also included bringing in other crew members, Navy, Coast Guard, and the like, to assist with them. Keep in mind that this middle sail that you're looking at in this image is about 55 feet tall. This is a huge rig. When Constitution is fully rigged up like this, even just sitting alongside, when the tall ship parades happen in Boston, as they will again, I think this coming year, Constitution's sailing rig is bigger than any of these other ships that are coming in. These newer ships themselves may be a lot bigger, but Constitution's rig is bigger than all of these training ships. The training ships are designed with smaller sails and a lot more of them so that you can keep training crew busy learning how to handle all of these sails and material. Here, you wanted a rig that was going to be as efficient as possible, moving this massive platform of guns in the quickest, most efficient way possible, and utilizing in battle the smallest number of crew that you could get so that the rest of them could stay busy operating the guns themselves. It's an astonishing feat. And to make it work is part of what makes Constitution and ships like this sort of the most complex machines of the pre-industrial age. This is a million working parts, and a lot of those working parts are its operators, those 450 crew. I mentioned, hold on. Oops. Rats. Oh, there we go. Apologize. I mentioned the watch quarter station bill and the details of what the crew had to do and how all that worked. And we've got great examples of this here at the museum. We actually know how all of this worked because, as I suggested, we have, among other things, Peter Turner's watch quarter station bill, who's mad with the rigging I was just showing you. But this is an astonishing piece of work because it also includes all of these details handwritten for what role each and every crew member was going to be playing for each and every function that the ship might go through. And in this case, I have it open to the page of tacking and wearing, where every job, every responsibility, in fact, every line, every rope, if you will, shows exactly who was responsible for being on that and handling that in every given situation. That watch quarter station bill also responds to different emergency situations that the crew would have to face if the ship caught fire, if the ship was flooding, if there were any other issues associated with it. Who did what, where, when, and how was all built into these crew assignments. And this is another thing that led to the complexity of this choreography, is the crew knowing exactly where they needed to be when. This was particularly important in the battle with Cyan and Levant when Charles Stewart is in command. And that battle was occurring as the sun was setting and the wind was really light. And Constitution was up against two smaller British frigates. Now, the combined firepower of these two British frigates was about the same, if not even a little less than Constitution, but they should have had the advantage of being two separate vessels that they could surround Constitution and fire both sides. But instead, these two British vessels lined up, as was the wont to do by the British, one behind the other, to approach Constitution from one side in a line. And so as the broadsides began, they were moving so slowly and the wind was so light that the smoke from the guns was just creating this cloud over the ships, and Stewart couldn't even see what Constitution was firing at anymore at that point. And so eventually he reached the point of deciding, calling for the crew to stop firing. A kind of gutsy thing to do in the middle of the battle. But as they slowly sailed out of this cloud of smoke, he realized what was happening. These two ships were now trying to cut him off, to rake him, as we just discussed, both from bow and stern. And so in order to prevent them from being able to do that, he immediately orders the crew to back all sails, to pivot all of those sails on the yards so that the wind was blowing backwards against them. He essentially threw the entire ship into reverse, sailing backwards, which not only put him back into that cloud, but also cut off one of the British ships from being able to cut him off from astern, delivered blistering broadsides that led them to surrender, while the other ship sailed temporarily away to make repairs. Constitution takes control of the one surrendered British ship, throws it back, and then goes back after the other one. This ability to order the crew in the middle of the battle to reverse all sails, literally sail the ship backwards, and then at the immediately right time, shift again and pull forward out of that, was a phenomenal sort of act of seamanship, and won the day in which they were able to track down and defeat both of these ships at once. This is the kind of maneuvering that Constitution was able to do under sail, and the kind of choreography and work that it took from the captains, the officers, and all the crew who knew exactly what their assignment was to make it work, to sail that ship at the same time that they were splitting their time to going, many of them were at least splitting their time to going to the guns. I hope that's been helpful. I haven't seen any particular questions on our chat window. If anyone has any, we have a couple minutes left. But otherwise, I will thank you for coming by. Again, this is our last one of our virtual ones of these for the winter-spring season. But stay tuned. We'll have more program coming in the coming seasons, most likely both live and virtual, and we'll let you know. You can connect to us at the USS Constitution Museum website at usscm.org, where you'll find archived earlier of these presentations, as well as lots of others, tons of other information about Constitution, its sails, how it operated, and all of its exploits during not only the War of 1812, where it earned its fame, but from throughout the 225 plus years that the ship has been sailing. Thanks for joining us today. I hope this was informative and you had fun, and stay in touch, and we will see you here from USS Constitution here in Boston. Thanks.